Right, we are live on YouTube. Ready to go.
Right, I'm going to turn my mic on. Nicholas, if you turn your Spaces mic on, there you go. So, hello everyone. Welcome to another bne Intellinews podcast. I'm Ben Aris, the editor-in-chief of bne Intellinews, and I'm very pleased today to welcome Nicolas Véron, who is a senior economist and founding member of the how do we pronounce this, Nicolas? It's Bruegel?
We insist on the spelling.
So Bruegel. It's a European think tank set up several years ago, and they're focused on economics. And I've been reading a lot about renewables and sustainability. But in the last few months, they've been doing some excellent work on the whole energy crisis and broaden that somewhat, which is why I invited Nicholas to come and talk about the energy crisis, cost of living crisis that's sweeping Europe. And it's causing a lot of problems. The economic war that we are fighting with Russia, I mean, the main focus of the reporting is on the kinetic war, the military action in Ukraine. But Russia, of course, Putin has been hitting back by playing games with energy prices, with food prices. That's driven up inflation to incredibly painful levels. It's driven up power bills, heating bills to incredibly painful levels. And there's this battle going on, whereas on the one hand, the Ukrainians are trying to win on the ground in Ukraine and doing very well. And on the other hand, Putin is screwing with everybody's economies in the West, and it's costing tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars. So, Nicholas, maybe you could start with Bruegel. The name came onto my radar about 4 or 5 months ago. And as I say, I'm reading everything avidly that you produce now. Could you give me a short bio of the think tank, of what it is and where you are? You yourself are in Washington, you're not, but the think tank itself is based in Belgium, is that right?
Yes, that's correct. Bruegel is in Brussels. It was created about 20 years ago. It actually started operations in 2005, but the preparatory work started in October 2002. So we're going to celebrate the 20th anniversary of that birth date next month. And it is really a kind of platform which brings together a lot of different perspectives. So, the governance and funding of Bruegel are based on bringing together, as donors, if you will, as members, as we call them, European member states and private sector participants, so big companies, if you will. But also governments of the larger European member states, including the UK, by the way, which has opted to stay there even after Brexit, Germany, France, Italy, Spain, you name it, and not all the smaller countries, because some of them have opted not to participate, but they're welcome to come in the future.
And your main
but
focus is
there are about 20 countries. And
the focus is economics, is it not? I mean, you're doing...
And the focus is on economics. It basically has the aim to provide facts and ideas, but also debates and perspectives on economic policy issues to help have better economic policies in Europe. And with a very, very transparent funding, very open approach to bringing together people from academia, from the policy world, from civil society. So it's an open platform in many ways. It has a permanent team, of course, in Brussels. I'm a bit of a special case because I'm also employed at the same time by the Peterson Institute for International Economics, which is another think tank in Washington, D.C. And that's why I'm joining from Washington today.
Okay. Before we go any further, I want to say to the audience that if you want to ask questions, then please use the chat function. You'll find it in the buttons on Zoom at the bottom. And we will attempt to answer questions as we go from things that you post there. So, Nicholas, let's dive in. I think the question of the day is who blew up Nord Stream 2? Do you have any idea? Because the speculation is rife. It could be the States, it could be the Ukrainians. People on Twitter were just suggesting that maybe it's the Polish because they've got a submarine for 2 years. But more seriously, what the question it raises is that with the tanks now 90% full in Europe, and particularly Germany as well, ahead of schedule, almost a month ahead of schedule, if Nord Stream 2 is taken out of the picture entirely, does that mean that Europe can get through winter? Does it need Nord Stream 1, I should say? Does it need any more gas? Because my understanding is that the German tanks are enough to supply Germany with gas for 2 months. And in order to get to the end of the winter, it's going to have to import more gas. I mean, that's normal. And of course, there are alternative supplies. Algeria, Norway stepped up 8%. LNG, of course, has been flooding in from the States particularly. And it seems that these alternatives will be sufficient to keep the tanks, to keep the gas supplies going until April. But I really haven't got a clear fix on it. I mean, doesn't it depend on the winter as well, how severe it is?
It does depend on the weather. So let's talk about the weather. And of course, we don't know
I'm
how
British.
hard.
There's nothing
Exactly.
I like more, yeah.
We cannot know how harsh the winter will be, but that plays a big role. It also depends a lot on how consumers of gas and energy resources will behave. So it is apparent that a number of industry consumers, big manufacturing plants, energy consuming industries, they will reduce their consumption because of the fact that it's so expensive now. But it is less clear for households and retail consumers, because there have been a lot of protective measures to shield them from the price increase. And also, frankly, it's more difficult to predict the behavior. So I think one of the big parameters is how many of us will, put a little bit less heating, take cold showers and the like through the winter, because that will have, of course, a massive impact on consumption and therefore on the possible gap between supply and demand.
And so a simple question, given a normal winter with average temperatures, with the 90% tanks full we have today, does that mean if there's no Nord Stream 2.1 gas imports that we can get to April without having rationing, without having, blackouts, rolling blackouts, brownouts?
Yeah, that's a baseline scenario in a way, but the degree of confidence on that baseline is relatively low. And also, of course, we need to get through not just this winter, but next winter as well. And we cannot expect that we will be able to replenish the gas the gas storage infrastructure during the spring and summer the way we did this year. In a way, it's paradoxical that Mr. Putin chose to cut the gas supply in September and not in March, but that has been his decision, and that's probably good news for us.
Yeah, I mean, briefly, I don't want to go deeply into that, but we've also already been looking ahead. And although we seem to be fine this year because there was significant supplies of Nord Stream gas up until June, that allowed us to fill the tanks very fast this year. This year actually was exceptionally fast in the early stages. However, going into the next year, after this heating season, is it possible then that we can fill the tanks next year? Because if you don't have any of that Nord Stream 1 supply, then there's not been enough time to put other sources into place. I don't know, the Germans are building 4 very big LNG terminals, which I guess will be online. So in theory, it seems possible that Germany will have significant alternative supplies of gas. But again, do you know or have any view on it?
I think you gave the response. I mean, we're betting a lot on LNG supplies, and with the infrastructures that is being put in place in a rush, of course, and at high cost, but worth it. There is hope that next winter will also be covered. Again, that depends on so many parameters that it's difficult to have any certainties. And assuming, of course, that the Russians did it on Monday on Nord Stream, the most likely interpretation of that is that it was a signal to say they can hit the infrastructure for European energy outside of their own territory, which, of course, is an act of aggression, but something that they have the capability to do, or at least had on Monday. So many different parameters come into the equation. Of course, it's impossible to make a predictive statement. But with all things if a number of things go right, which may be an optimistic assumption, then we should be okay.
And that's a good point. I mean, you're saying it could go right. I mean, Bruegel did a paper whereby you were saying if Europe cuts its consumption by 15%, then we should be fine. And then it was later the EU picked it up, and von Leyen also, and she tried to do this mandatory 15% where Brussels decides. However, Spain, Portugal, Greece, they were like, look, we don't buy Russian gas. This is on you, Germany. This is your fault. We're not going to bail you out. And that whole thing fell apart. It ended up being massively watered down. I think it was 17 out of 28 members got some sort of carve out or exemption. But this thing about the reductions, it seems that everybody's actually retreated to their own national interests. And if you look at the Italians, for example, they've made no reductions at all. And I was reading somewhere, had they made 3% reduction in their gas consumption, then they would have had 80% full at a time when they only had 60% full. And that surprised me. It seemed that you actually have to make relatively small reductions in order to make a big difference to the amount of gas that you use.
Yeah, I think there are many things to unpack here. And by the way, you mentioned Bruegel's publications. I have to emphasize that I didn't author them. I'm a colleague of the heroes of this story, and I want to give a special shout out to my colleagues, Simone Tagliapietra and Gerhard Zachmann in particular, and the whole team that has been working on energy at Bruegel. But we have a lot of internal conversations, of course, so I'm happy to channel them. I just want to give credit where it's due.
Sure.
So on this, in a way, I alluded to it. It's very unprecedented, and clearly the behavior during the summer is not indicative of what we will see during the winter, if only because there's not a lot of air conditioning in Europe, and therefore we don't have the kind of consumption curves in the summer and peaks in the summer that exist in other countries, particularly in the US. So we will really discover the answer to your question during this winter. And in a way, it's a question of collective mindset, right? I mean, as I said, any of us can opt to take cold showers and decrease the heating, but only to a certain extent. We're not ready probably to freeze for the whole winter. So how much of this kind of collective mobilization, engagement of the citizenship is going to happen? It's a big question mark, and I think we'll all learn. We'll probably observe very different patterns in different countries, and that's to be expected. And we'll learn a lot of lessons, but we don't know those lessons yet.
Isn't this one of the weaknesses of the EU, though? Because it's just, to be blunt, a trade club. It's not a federated political entity. And that's the weakness that Putin's playing on, trying to, augment the fractures. I mean, Hungary, of course, has gone its own way, and the relationships between Brussels and Warsaw are not particularly good, unless you ask them about Russia, and then they're on board 100%. But the response here in this economic war is that because there's no unity within Europe, that Russia has the opportunity here to play these energy games and stoke these resentments. And
I would dispute your semantics. The EU is much more than a trade club. It does have a form of political identity. It's a different political identity from a cohesive, centralized nation state like France or England. But even if you look at actually jurisdictions we just have mentioned, the United Kingdom, we're seeing different countries in one country, right? With Scotland, Northern Ireland, England, and also Wales. Germany is a very decentralized country. There's a lot of horse trading between the lender and with different levels of government. So not saying that the EU is comparable to those two sovereign countries, the United Kingdom and Germany, but just to say that maybe the French and English, you and I, more than anybody else, we have a tendency to project a vision of, very centralized political entities with a strong capital, actually overweight capital, and a top-down chain of command, which actually is not what people experience in many other countries that have a long track record of functioning quite well. So yes, the EU is a quasi-federal construct, not quite federal. There is sovereignty at the level of the member states, and that's very important in the way it's built, but it is a single framework of law. It has a Supreme Court, Court of Justice of the European Union. It has enforcement mechanisms at the EU level in a number of important policies, including, of course,
Indeed.
trade policy, competition policy, but also a number of new sectors. I've worked a lot over the last 10 years, for example, on what is nicknamed banking union, the fact that banks now are supervised by the European Central Bank in the Eurozone and a little bit further. That's a very important, it's kind of wonkish and maybe doesn't speak
but
to
let
the
me
common
ask
people.
you,
But
let me
it's
ask you,
it's a very strong point of centralization. So you're right, there is all this back and forth, all this horse trading. It's often immensely frustrating for both those who do it and those who observe it. But I think what we have observed, and this is an important point I want to make here, is that Putin has underestimated the cohesiveness of the EU. He has tried, as you mentioned, to divide and conquer since before the invasion. And by and large, he has failed miserably. Even Hungary, and there are lots of things to be said about Mr. Orban and his regime in Hungary, even Hungary has voted for very forceful packages of sanctions time and again. So the negotiation, the horse trading is sometimes a bit, ugly to watch, but the results are actually quite much more than
we
just.
have to admit that the EU has shown extraordinary unity, particularly at the beginning of the war, and that they brought out the most extreme sanctions, and everybody rallied around and signed up for that. And I don't think Putin was expecting either the severity of some of the sanctions that came out of left field, like the freezing of the central bank funds and the SWIFT ban, which was, so that was very good. But the practical question here is that given the disunity and the national interests that lie within the EU because of its sort of half-baked nature as a political entity, how long will this war go on? Because I can definitely sense that there's a feeling at the moment, and we'll get on to the policy responses for the energy crisis in a minute, which highlights this. But there's a feeling that we just need to get through this winter. It's going to be really tough because we're facing down Putin, but by spring next year, it's going to get a lot easier. We've already mentioned that people are starting to think ahead and saying, actually, refilling the tanks next winter or next summer is going to be difficult. But then there is a point where Putin has this energy card to play, but it's not going to last very long because we will, in the West, reorientate away from Russian oil. We will replace the Russian gas with LNG, or, of course, renewables are becoming increasingly important. At what point, how long will it take to get to the point where the power of Putin's energy weapon has diminished to the point where it's no longer useful? I mean, I could guess 2 years. By 2024, we'd have enough renewables, we'd have enough alternative sources that we wouldn't need Russian gas anymore. We would get rid of that dependency on that last 30% that we're importing at the moment.
Well, again, I think we have to be careful about scenarios, right? And hypotheses. If Putin, God forbid, starts attacking our energy infrastructure, in not just in Ukraine, but in Europe, those calculations are modified, to say the least.
Sorry, you mean he starts blowing them up?
Well, that's a signal he sent in the Baltic Sea. And of course, he blew up his own infrastructure, assuming that he's the one who decided it, which doesn't strike me as a particularly unreasonable assumption. But clearly, the intent was to send a signal. So I'm just, extrapolating from what we know to what we don't know. But many people have made the same extrapolation here. My point is that I don't think it's fair to say that the lack of decision-making capacity of the EU is why the war is not over yet and Ukraine has not won yet. This is a military war between Ukraine and Russia. The Ukrainian capacity to fight has been admirable and very surprising to many. It was not expected by many people that the Ukrainians would be able to prevent the capture of the big cities, Kiev, Kharkiv, Odessa, and more, and even able to push back as they have done in the Kharkiv region last month. So we've had a lot of good news, good surprises on the military front, I think. And remember, in terms of the economic front, that Putin had been preparing for this for at least the last 8 years, since the previous round of fighting and sanctions. So the fact that there was some resiliency of the Russian economy against Western sanctions is actually not a surprise. If there is a surprise, it is that some of the sanctions had not been anticipated at all by Putin and his team. We don't know how long the war will last. There are many possible developments here. I think we have to prepare for a long war. And the latest decision about mobilization, which is not so partial, goes in that direction. So the baseline assumption has to be that the war will last several years. Probably by the mid-2020s, if not before, we will not be dependent on the Russian energy weapon at all. We're already much less dependent on it than we were at the beginning of the invasion in February. And of course, there are many questions about the military front, but also about our own financial support to Ukraine. Maybe we'll talk about that, which will determine who wins this war and when.
So looking at the other side of the coin, the economic war, I mean, our argument has been that the way Putin is fighting back is to make this extremely expensive. And I'm not just talking about the 40 billion in US arms and the 12 billion they announced today in macro support. I'm talking about the €500 billion euros that the EU has already committed in terms of dealing with energy sanctions, which are the tax cuts, the price caps, the energy subsidies, the one-off payments that's been going on. I mean, here in Germany, I think they're up to 100 billion. The Italians have already spent 50 and say that will go to 100 by the end of the year. And that the enormous cost of this. And how much of that can the EU take? I mean, the EU's capacity to borrow is far larger than Russia's. So in theory, they can just keep borrowing, but they come into this already with weak balance sheets that were caused by very heavy spending that went on during the 2 years of Corona. So now they're faced with another enormous bill. I mean, at what point does it become unsustainable?
So you're asking the question of, to use a jargon of economists, fiscal capacity in the European Union, right? And as you know, we don't have a fiscal union. We don't have a federal fiscal system with the ability to tax and spend and borrow at the EU level. We only have baby steps towards that. And the big one, of course, has been in 2020 in response to the pandemic, when EU member states unanimously agreed to launch a program called Next Generation EU, which for the first time ever was the European Union borrowing on the markets at scale in very large numbers, in the hundreds of billions over a number of years, to finance a joint response to the pandemic. But other than that, we have national fiscal systems, national spending frameworks, and that is the answer to your question. So far, these extraordinary measures of support to consumers to mitigate the cost of the energy prices, but also other measures, are borne by the national budgets, by and large. Some of that is carried under the program Next Generation EU, but generally speaking, it is a national effort. At this point, that's fine. This is how it should be. If you apply a principle of subsidiarity. If the member states can do it, let them do it. Maybe there will come a point, and I think we're still far from that, where pooling the effort at the EU level will be necessary to ensure its sustainability. At that time, we know that we can do it because we did it with Next Generation EU in 2020 in response to the pandemic. We can do it again. Why don't we do it already? For obvious political reasons. There is reluctance to share the risks and the spending in a number of member states. That's normal, but there is this capacity. And in terms of the EU level borrowing capacity, there is a lot of creditworthiness. So basically there is, I shouldn't say there is no limit, but there is no practical limit to the extent that the EU, if it does decide politically to pool its efforts together to get through this difficult phase of the war of aggression of Russia in Ukraine, we can do it. So there's a lot of hope here. I don't think we're cornered.
Yeah. So, I mean, to put it in simple terms, it's cost $500 billion so far. It seems that this phase going through to the end of the heating season, the bill is going to go up to $1 trillion. And then if the same energy crisis next year, you're going to add another $1 trillion. But you're saying at this point, we can absorb that, or the member states at a sovereign level can absorb that kind. And then if it starts getting too painful, as you say, during the pandemic, we had this first sort of proto-European level borrowing, and the EU as a whole is so enormous, the size of the economy is so enormous, that there's a whole nother level of borrowing we could do, because we're assuming the war's going to go on for 2 or 3 years. And hopefully at the end of that point, if Putin sort of runs out of steam, then, you know, the end scenario would be a collapse, or at least the Russian budget would start running into serious trouble, which also seems likely after a few years. And then we come out the other side.
There's a saying, a trillion here, a trillion there, and soon enough you're talking real money. So it used to be with $1 billion, but now, you know, there's inflation. No, seriously, I think you frame it correctly. Harold James, a great financial historian, said at an event recently that each side, and he meant Russia, of course, on one side, and on the other, Ukraine, but all the nations that support Ukraine, including the US, the EU, the UK, but many others, Japan, South Korea, and you know, it's more than a Western coalition. It's not a complete rest of the world coalition, but it's somewhere in between. Anyway, the way he put it is each side is gambling on the collapse of the other. And I think that's a very good way to summarize what we are in. Putin is gambling on much more than the defeat of Ukraine. He's gambling on the breakup of the NATO coalition and, frankly, on the breakup of the EU itself. That's what he wants to see happening. That's how he thinks in terms of victory. Correspondingly, I think it is a fact that even so we, you know, the EU, the UK, US, Japan, others, we would like to see a ceasefire. We have to prepare for a situation where there is no ceasefire, and where basically the fighting will have to continue until the point when Russia can no longer sustain it. And it's very difficult to say when that point comes, and we're seeing things happening in Russia time and again that represent surprises one way or another. But we have to make that assumption. Of course, it has to be hoped for that at some point the Russian leadership, be it Putin or somebody else, will stop this tragic nonsense before it comes to a point of collapse. But we cannot rest on that assumption. We need to have a plan B. And I think that's exactly the mindset in which policymakers in Europe and also in the US and Japan and elsewhere are right now.
Well, there's a famous analyst called Tim Ash in London who has speculated today that the setback, the counteroffensive in Ukraine has been so spectacular and that Putin's been forced into the corner with the mobilization, the chaotic mobilization that's going on at the moment. And that he was saying the attack on Nord Stream and a physical attack on an key energy asset, plus all the talk of nuclear bombs, is just trying to soften the West up for peace talks, a negotiated solution where Putin could walk away with Donbass, the land corridor down to Crimea and Crimea itself. But I don't know, I think that would be to underestimate resolve Putin has about how long he's going to take this and to what extreme he will take this. But it brings me back to the energy crisis. We did a piece where we went to look at the energy intensive industries in Europe, Central but Western as well, and started to catalog all the plants that are closing down. And there's actually a lot of them. Metal plants that use electric arc furnaces, fertilizers who don't have gas as a feedstock anymore. Glass, famously, there's going to be a shortage of car windscreens because glass is very intensive. And all of these things, these companies, these Western companies, they're just not economically viable anymore with energy prices at 10 times what they are. To what extent is that going on? So how worried should we be about heavy industry closing down? Is it permanent? I mean, are these companies going to recover? Doesn't that depend on energy prices going back to normal? And how much damage does that do to the Western economies?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very nuanced picture. Some of them are closing temporarily. Some of them will close permanently. In some cases, this is just an acceleration of a shift in terms of the value chain that was happening anyway. So a lot of these high energy consumers are actually not particularly sophisticated industry, even those which are located in the territory of the European Union, and they would have migrated for a number of reasons to other parts of the world, or gotten out of the competition anyway at some point in the near future, even without this energy crisis. So it's difficult in a way to build a counterfactual scenario. If we didn't have the energy crisis, would the industry structure stay exactly as it is? Of course not. This energy crisis, of course, is damaging for a number of industries, no denying that. But I think in terms of the high value added, the most productivity intensive industries, you generally don't see that, and I'm simplifying outrageously here, in the most energy intensive segments of the economy. So this is to say that, yes, there will be pains, there will be transformations, there will be restructuring, but it is not, to me, a consequence of that, an inference of that this transformation will be crippling for the European economy. It's just one more thing we have to adapt to.
So it's going to make some changes, and restructuring, but it's not fundamentally going to gut the economies.
Exactly, and frankly, I mean, I'm going to go into a cliche here, but as Europeans, our strengths in the world economy are not about energy resources. They're about education. They're about skills. They're about legacies of what we know how to do, because we have some forms of collective organizations that have been well performing in a number of industry segments. And this competition is never over. It's, of course, there has been, and that's good news for the world, a lot of rising competitiveness in other parts of the world, starting with China, but not only, in the last 20, 30 years. But I think in Europe, we're still living quite well, actually. Even so, I come from a country where people like to complain, but if you look at welfare spending, if you look at education, healthcare, infrastructure, I think in Europe we have a pretty good deal by and large compared with other places in the world, especially for those who are not at the top of the wealth ranking, and I think we will be able to keep that.
So let me ask you two questions. One general, the key to the energy crisis is, of course, the very high energy prices. And they went to insane levels in the summer, and they started to fall off again. But they've gone from insanely high to just very, very expensive. And even when the prices have come down, we went from 10, 20 times normal down to, but now they're still like 2, 3 times normal. And as we just said with the industry, I mean, that makes a lot of heavy or energy intensive industry unviable. And part of this is that if, we've switched from importing cheap Russian gas to very, very expensive LNG. And the only reason we've got so much is that we just simply outbid Asia, which is very dependent on that. But to what extent are those higher energy prices permanent? And more specifically, there's talk here in Germany that the economic model has been fundamentally broken. It relied on cheap Russian gas to produce very high quality widgets which it could export. And if suddenly it doesn't have that cheap Russian gas, which it won't do, then the German economy doesn't work properly anymore. We had the first trade deficit in 30 years, and I think it was in May in Germany. So first, high energy prices, are they permanent?
So depends on your time horizon, of course. We're engaged in a green transition in Europe, and we've waited far too long to start that in a serious way. But I'm certainly hopeful that we will increasingly depend on renewables and not just on LNG. And of course, with a lot of debates on, what is the right mix, what is the right pace, what's the place of nuclear in all this. There's a big embarrassment in France, of course, with all the problems with the nuclear plants on which the country relies a lot. So how can we fix that? Lots of different questions here. But I think the long-term future is one in which even natural gas is not the mainstay. The mainstay is really depending more and more on renewables. And I don't think that's utopian. That's something we just have to work a lot on, invest a lot in. Now, when you spoke about the German economic model, here again, I think that's a massive oversimplification. It is true that there are lots of energy-intensive industries in Germany, but saying that the German manufacturing industry export miracle was just a function of cheap energy, I think does not square with the facts. So I personally view the German strength as a strength of corporate governance and adaptability of its corporate model. And I think we will see that adaptability again at play in managing this transition. Of course, many people are worried. It is a transition. It is a transformation. You mentioned the trade figures. In a way, you could say this is a mean reversal, right? It was impossible for Germany to keep having all these export trade imbalances forever. This is not a predictive statement, just a comment on the latest figures that you mentioned. But I think when you're familiar with the German Mittelstand, all these export champions in manufacturing and different segments, they're very resourceful and they're not successful just because they're buying Russian gas. So they will adapt, most of them.
Because the plan in Germany, particularly, has been already to move away from gas. I mean, Merkel was in Moscow in September, is it 2021 or 2020? Anyway, and there she told Putin that, look, we're not going to import any Russian gas within 20 years, which is why Germany in particular was so reluctant to sign these long-term contracts that Putin was pushing. And I must say, ironically, Europe has just signed long-term LNG contracts with the States. So it's locked itself into this gas that it didn't want to do. But the point being was that the German plan, the EU plan, was to replace that gas with renewables. But wasn't the plan for that to happen over the next 10 or 20 years? I mean, isn't one of the upshots of this whole conflict going to be to massively accelerate that? I mean, I know that Bruegel has been pushing the whole renewable things and arguing that actually with the 15% reduction, what that comes part and parcel with is there's a lot of renewable investment we can do accelerate in order to take the pressure off even faster. I mean, so we can complete that green transition, not in 20 years, but maybe in 5 years.
Well, I don't know about the exact, deadline for completion, but I think your framing is exactly right. It is an acceleration of the energy transition. It's something that we should have been able to do on our own, but now we're doing under external pressure, and it will be made more painful by the fact that it is under external pressure. But at the end of the day, this is a necessary transformation, so we need to do it.
And well, let's move on, because I mean, Bruegel just did a very interesting, but rather long and boring, to be honest, paper where it dove into the details of what each major country in the European Union is doing in order to tackle the energy crisis. And my takeaway from that is that most people's plan has been to throw money at it. Because again, the political problem here is that you've got 10 times increases in energy in general. But, my personal example, living in Berlin, our energy bill is going to double. But if it's not going to go up 10 times, and the governments are basically taking on the pain of that. They're capping. I mean, the favorite solution is to cap the energy prices, to cap the bills, to pass on some of that to the consumer, and then to raise the money to pay the difference by hitting energy companies with windfall taxes. Because, if you're in the gas business, you're paying 10 times as much. But if you're in the solar energy business, suddenly you're benefiting from these massively high power prices. And you're making extraordinary profits. And so governments are coming and taking that away in order to subsidize that. But there's a whole variety of mechanisms. Other people have cut VAT, other people have given one-off payments. And can you sum up? I mean, having read through all of it, it wasn't really clear to me, all these different mechanisms. How effective is it? Is the bottom line simply that governments are trying to stop the huge increases getting to their citizens, and that's a politically driven thing? And how they do that, how they fund that, is a multiple choice question for each individual government.
I think this is, governments, let's face it, are in firefighting mode, right? I mean, there's a crisis, there is an emergency, there is a risk of many people not being able to cope, and this is real. So governments are trying their best to address that and take out of the landscape the most dire scenarios that could lead to social unrest, but also, frankly, to a lot of sufferings that is better avoided. Now, of course, that should not translate into windfall profits or subsidies to people who can cope and companies that can cope and should share some of the burden. So it's difficult to fine-tune. Some governments are probably doing it better than others. The way to do it, which was a bit your question, I think has to be as decentralized as possible because conditions are very different in different member states. So, so the fact that you have this long and boring paper with lots of different responses in different member states, I think is as much a feature as a bug. There's no reason that there would be a one-size-fits-all response. And as we discussed before, as long as this can be financed by individual member states on their normal fiscal mechanisms, that's probably the best way to go for now, because we don't have a permanent European fiscal mechanism, federal financing in place. We have one which is temporary with Next Generation EU, but we don't have a permanent one. Again, it's very reassuring that this option exists, and we may be able to activate one in future, but we don't have it now. So at this point, you have this scattered response. Is the fact that it's scattered a problem? In some areas, yes. In many areas, no, because this is local responses to local challenges. Even so, everybody faces kind of the same challenges. So responses have to be adjusted to the local conditions.
So I mentioned one of the favorite responses is to cap prices and to use windfall taxes. But to what extent, it seems to me that people are moving slowly towards what I think, having looked at it a bit now, seems like an obvious solution. Because, you know, again, if you take someone like Germany, I think half of the energy is generated by renewables. And then you've got a few like fossil fuel burners that provide the base loads. So when the wind's not blowing and the sun's not shining, and you need to have something there for base load. But the swing provider is the gas, and that comes online with peak demands, you know, in the evening when it's cold, and of course that one is the expensive one because they've got 10 times more in costs. But the problem is with the electricity market in particular, that when you suddenly the electricity costs 10 times much, it lifts the tariff for everybody. So all the cheap producers suddenly get this 10 times increase in price. And one of the solutions to this price cap is not just to cap the prices for the whole market, is to differentiate between the different types of power and saying, you know, you as a solar power producer, you cannot charge more than X, which is, you know, your cost of production plus some profit margin. And that way you can stop, you can limit the increase in the cost of the power to just the gas producers when they're doing that peak providing thing, and everyone else doesn't get the windfall profits in the first place. You don't need to tax them. But then that means we're moving towards a fundamentally different way of charging for power and calculating it, and a much more complicated system, but one that would actually avoid this problem. Because then if you have to buy extra gas, you know, for peak 7 o'clock in the evening on Saturday, then you've only got a few hours where it's very expensive. And the rest of the week, the prices remain normal. Whereas at the moment, you've got this permanent increase by whatever it is, 4-fold, 10-fold in prices that are just causing these insane costs, but at the same time, these insane profits. Are we getting anywhere near that?
So we don't have an alternative model at this point, which is workable to the one on which the European market has been built up in the recent times, which is this pricing at marginal cost, as you described it succinctly. And the marginal cost principle may sound nonsensical in some circumstances, but that actually works quite well. And these market mechanisms have provided a framework for people to invest in the last few years. So if you change the rules of the games all the time, you will have less investment. This is a fact, we know that. And if you want at least to mobilize private investment, which is clearly what we need to do in Europe, because that's where the big money is, including to finance the green transition, as we mentioned. So imagine you're an investor, in a solar panel facility. part of your investment calculation is that sometimes you will have big spikes in price, and that's when you will make the money that allows you to reimburse your investment. So if those spikes are capped systematically, that changes your investment calculation fundamentally. This is not to say that the price cap idea is a bad idea necessarily, because we know that the current circumstances are exceptional. It's just to say there is a big trade-off here. And there is no silver bullet. There is no ideal solution to the challenges we're facing in this very exceptional market environment that has been created by the Russian invasion.
Because I've seen argued that one of the reasons why this system of tiered caps, that target or are designed to suit particular types of generation, which all have different costs, that is because people are afraid to dissuade investment into particularly renewables going forward, and then that would slow this whole transition process down. And I think Ukraine is actually a good example, because Poroshenko introduced these very generous green tariffs, and Ukraine's attracted virtually no FDI in the last, whatever it is, since Maidan 2014, except into the renewable sector, where it's poured in. And they actually have a very sophisticated, and I think they're up to 15% of production already is in renewables. And they're still investing because these tariffs are actually remain generous. So there's kind of a, I don't know, quid pro quo, or even an irony there, that keeping the investment coming in, that means offering the profits, is very, very important.
I mean, I call me a pro-capitalist dinosaur, but I think if you don't offer prospects for profit making, you won't get private investment.
There's a flip side to this, because one of the other responses to this crisis is that government have been subsidizing the bills. So, here, as I was saying, we're going to pay whatever it is, 200, 400 euros more for our electricity, which is painful, but, we turn off some lights, we budget a bit, and we can cope. But one of the upshots of that is that the subsidies do not carry the pain to the consumer. So the incentive of the consumer to make the reductions is very low. And you actually subsidize the consumption, particularly of gas. And Italy is a great example, because there's been no reductions there at all. So in a way, this policy of subsidizing and protecting the consumer from this pain is counterproductive, because it's ended up with a lot more consumption than there should be. So, I mean, I don't know, is there a happy middle ground between that?
Exactly. And again, it's a trade-off. What you're describing is irony of what, as we discussed before, has been an emergency response, firefighting, avoiding very distressful situations for a large number of individuals. But it is clear that it is not a good policy if it were to be sustained. It's a temporary fix. It's not sustainable. It shouldn't be sustained. And it has to be replaced with something else. This is very clear. We don't want to subsidize fossil fuel consumption on a sustained basis in Europe. This cannot be Europe's strategy.
I've got a couple of questions. David Eddick's got one here. He was saying that the modest long-term LNG contracts with the US come with the option to ship elsewhere in the world. And there is this competition now between Europe and Asia. And you take countries like Japan, which are almost entirely dependent on LNG. And I read that there actually isn't enough LNG production in the world to be able to replace the Russian supply in Europe and service Asia. And this year was made easier because China's demand was fairly slow. And Qatar, they're driving a hard bargain too. And they have this huge project that's due to come online in 2025. I forget the name of it, but that would massively increase. However, they haven't gone ahead with the project yet because they're demanding long-term 30-year contracts to finance it. And so on the one hand, with the LNG in particular, which has gone, and the interesting thing with LNG was that it was designed, or in Europe anyway, the role it played, apart from Portugal, which is heavily dependent on it, was as a sort of swing provider of energy. So if the winter was very cold, you could ship in a bit more LNG. But it's emerging now as the main source, or one of the major sources of gas. But you've caught in this bind between, tying yourself up to long-term contracts with the States. Qatar's asking for long-term contracts to increase the capacity so that they would be able to cover this extra demand. And doesn't it mean that at the end of the day, the EU is going to be beholden to all of these people and is going to get forced to signing these long-term contracts that it doesn't want, because effectively it's just cut its own leg off in terms of refusing to buy Russian gas?
At this point, it's Putin cutting off the gas and blowing up the pipelines, if that assumption is correct. So, I think we discovered a bit late that we had excessive dependency on Russia. Cutting that dependency is something that's happening anyway on Putin's initiative, but also something that should happen because that dependency is unhealthy. And I think here, to echo what we were saying before, you have to distinguish between the medium-term horizon, where short and medium term, we're doing what we can to basically fill the gaps in the least damaging way possible, but it is not something that can be sustained over the long term. And then the long-term policy is that has to rely much more on renewables. So, of course, gas producers like Qatar want long-term contracts, and so there is some bargaining which is going on as we speak, and it's possible to find compromises. But at the end of the day, we don't want our long-term future to depend on natural gas. We need our short-term and medium-term future to depend on it, and we have to find it where it is. As for the fact is that there is not enough to feed the world, well, to a certain extent, there is elasticity, right? To speak the jargon of economists, if the price is higher, the demand will be lower, and conversely. So I think the adjustment between capacity and demand that you were referring to in terms of Asia, Europe, China, and the like, this will happen through prices, and that means that this resource will stay expensive for some time, most probably, and that's also something we'll have to live with.
So we said, I mean, could you characterize it this way? I mean, we've said the kinetic war in Ukraine now, we think probably go on for a year, 2, maybe possibly 3, unless one side or the other collapses.
I didn't exactly say that. I said we have to prepare for a long war.
Right.
I think it has to be our baseline scenario for policy. In terms of predicting how it will go, I don't think any of us knows.
No,
but
of
I
course.
think the policymakers should not put themselves in a squeeze where they say, well, if the war is over next year, we're okay. If not, we have a problem.
Yeah, no, I agree. But what I was driving at was like the kinetic war, time horizon, sort of reasonable assumption is like year 2, maybe. However, this thing with the energy transition is much more serious and long-term, because on the one hand, you've got Qatar trying to do 30-year contracts and the States with LNG supplies so they can develop those businesses. And on the other hand, you've got the EU who's desperately trying to go to renewables, but that's also a 5 to 10-year process. And then once we get to this green transition, when it's completed, then the whole natural gas business sort of should just fade away, should die. I mean, to some extent, because it's not necessary anymore that we've got the energy. So we've got kinetic for 2-year time period, and we've got green transition for 5 to 10-year period. And we've got to try and get from here to there somehow.
Isn't that exactly why the producers want very long-term contracts?
Yes, I mean, that was why Putin was pushing so hard, because, I mean, Gazprom had already said it was going to switch to Asia, but it had a 10-year program to do that. So, I mean, they've been forced to accelerate that in the same way that Europe has been forced to accelerate its green. So there were big changes going on already, but we're now in this very confused 10-year period where on the one hand, Gazprom is building a Power of Siberia 2, and the SOP pipeline is going to be doubled so that they can switch to Asia. And on our side, we're building those renewables and other alternative sources as fast as we can. But in the meantime, we're going to have to import expensive oil from Saudi Arabia, which has to come twice as far. We're going to buy very expensive LNG, which costs 3 or 4 times more than pipe gas. And we're going to have to do that until we have this transition to green finished. But, that's still a 5 to 10-year program. I mean, I've seen some economists like our friends and colleagues at IIF saying that we're moving into a new phase, global economy. We've had 10 years of very low inflation, very cheap funding, and now we're looking at slow growth, high inflation, while all of this goes on, because there's been a phase change in the way that the economy works. Do you agree with that?
I'm less sure. I think at this point we have high inflation, high energy prices. Where it will be in 5 years, if we knew, we would be rich, as the saying goes. And I think at this point we have to get there. And going back to the wars, this war has to be won by the right side, which is not Russia. I don't know how long it will take. I don't have a baseline assumption here. As I said, it can be short, it can be long, but we should be prepared for a long war, including ones that last for more than 2 or 3 years. So I'm thinking more in terms of risk and scenarios and in terms of forecast, because I think the world right now is very difficult to forecast, especially over a long horizon.
I have another specific question. I'll take a last one from Roberto Ritz, who's asking about Italy, which is famously indebted. And I think the UK is now about to join that club. And if it gets into trouble with all this borrowing and its profligate use of gas and not being frugal with that, will the EU Commission come and bail it out? I mean, is that a possibility that if anyone starts getting into debt trouble, that there will be a European-wide rescue mission?
Well, we've been through the Eurozone crisis, we've been through the pandemic shock and Next Generation EU. We've learned a lot. So I think some strident discourses about Eurozone breakup and financial instability having certain types of consequences in Europe has become a bit stale because of all those lessons learned. So Italy has a new governing majority. To be honest, if I had been an Italian voter, which I'm not, I would probably not have voted for Fratelli d'Italia. But this is what the Italian people have chosen. The signals so far are that this new coalition will actually be quite I wouldn't say conservative, but certainly restrained in its economic and financial management. These are early signals. I don't want, again, to make too much of a forecast, but the anticipation at this point, including in the marketplace, is that this is not a regime change in terms of economic and financial matters. And obviously, we should know in the next few days who's the finance minister. This will be a big signal to the market. But Mrs. Meloni has been very careful to signal that she didn't want to rock the boat in that department, even so she may be very disruptive or wants to change a number of things on other fronts. Also, frankly, she will face, like all European leaders, a difficult environment in the next few months. So there will be hardship. Because there will be for everybody, not just for Italy. And I don't think, frankly, politically, she will want to be blamed for that. So this is not a moment to make reckless economic and financial decisions because citizens may want to hold you accountable if you do. And this is, by the way, exactly what we see in the UK right now.
Not to make reckless and irresponsible decisions. I think we should take this message maybe to Downing Street from the events of the last few days. Nicolas, we've run out of time. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. It was fascinating. I think we batten down the hatches and prepare for a long, hard struggle, but it looks like we're going to be okay. We'll get through this one way or the other.
Well, let's hope so, at least. Thank you very much for having me. And again, if you're interested in Bruegel research, I encourage you very much to follow my colleagues' work because it's much more interesting on these issues than mine.
Indeed. And we write about it regularly. And to everyone out there listening, thank you for taking the time and joining us. I'd like to give ourselves a plug at the end. We're following all these stories on a daily basis at bne.eu, and on the website, the right-hand side, you can sign up to Editor's Picks, which is our free email digest, where also you have the pleasure, I hope, of reading my daily blog about things that are going on. You can see on the slide on the screen, there's also the Pro News service, which is our premium service for professionals, where we go into a lot more detail, macro, corporate, finance, about what's going on. You can find this interview on our YouTube channel, EE and Intellinews YouTube channel, with all the previous ones, and you can watch this later at your leisure or share it with your friends. So once again to everyone, and to Nicolas, thank you very much for taking the time. I'll see you next time. All the best.